I was browsing online for new seeds to experiment and stumbled upon an exotic fruit I had to try. Its spiky alien appearance hooked me in, and the odd description of its taste perplexed me. Claims of a cucumber, pineapple, banana lime flavor boggled my mental palate. Little did I know that this African specimen would take me on a journey of discovery in a centuries-old quest for my own origins. I'm Siloé Oliveira, and I invite you to experience this journey with me as I unravel the roots of diversity that make our natural world vibrate with wealth. In the beginning of the 16th century, European navigators ventured around the globe to find new trade routes and ended up mixing genetic material across the world at an unprecedented scale and speed. It started with the Portuguese and Spanish conquistadors who colonized America, introducing new exotic foods to Europe's gardens and plates. And culminated with the British Empire, who later in the 19th century dominated the waters, seeking the exotic around the world to collect, catalog, and classify, laying waste to many natural species in the process. The last 5 centuries have been marked by global movement and discovery. We humans innately like to classify and discriminate. Finding generalizations and bigger trends is how we learn. That is what we call finding a pattern. Nature is full of repeating patterns, from macro to micro, and every stage in between. Repeating ratios, swirls, and spirals inform the fabric of our lives. When I first saw pictures of the African melon, or kiwano as it is also known, I couldn't help but be reminded of the deep water creatures and shells. These design echoes figure into our unconscious minds as we draw links that may not be there. I love to grow and to try fruits and vegetables I don't know because it allows me to see the world with fresh eyes once more. As kids, we are naturally curious. We want to experience the world around us and are mostly excited with pleasant experiences. Unpleasant and painful ones can cause us to recoil and lose interest on what's different. Many of us fall into our old habits of sticking to what is known because it is comfortable, because these customary experiences reinforce our previous judgment. They validate our judgments, and we all naturally look for validation. That is why we have seen fast food chains grow. They provide a place of solace for many, a reliable, familiar spot with familiar tasting food and surroundings, no matter where you are, in Kansas City or Mumbai. But the universe is vaster and more diverse. With my precious seed packet at hand, I decided to use the plate germination method to ensure sprouting. Although this may have been a bit fancier version for the plate than usual. Such rare seed deserved VIP treatment. You can use any closed container you want. The important thing is to place the seeds in a paper napkin that is moist but not waterlogged, and prevent evaporation by covering it. You should check on it every day to make sure that the seeds don't dry out or mold over. If they dry, they die. If they mold, they were already dead to begin with. I was really pampering these melon seeds. They were advertised as rare, and the packet only contained a few seeds, so I couldn't mess it up. Botanical explorers recognize the value of diversity even if their main reason to find and classify new plants was monetary. We may not think of plants as wealth because gold and silver have long been hammered into our collective imagery as truly valuable things. But looking deeper, plants are the originators of wealth. While we like to see industry as the main source of the goods that make our lives rich, plants are far superior alchemists. Many of the economic staples we have today were brought to global prominence by these early explorers of the 16th and 17th century. Corn, cotton, tobacco, spices, coffee, and sugar all became household products central to global trading. Sugar proved incredibly lucrative as it satisfied our childish desire for sweet things. The transatlantic trade provided this supremely sweet substance to a growing consumer base. However, it had a severe and bitter cost attached to it. that has left scars up until today. African slaves were shipped to the Americas by the millions to labor in sugarcane fields. Slavery was not a novel idea, being practiced since antiquity under different empires. The contemporary Barbary slave trade captured over 1 million North Africans and Europeans into slavery. African elites had profited by raiding and selling Africans from competing tribes into slavery. Over 7 million sub-Saharan Africans were also sold into Barbary slavery. The transatlantic slave trade eclipsed these in scale, as estimates of more than 12 million Africans were sent across the ocean, proving highly lucrative to the Portuguese traders. Brazil was the epicenter of it all. Being born in Brazil, I was always aware of this bitter past. The confluence of Europeans, native Brazilians, and Africans created a rich tapestry of people and culture, but a lingering pain continues. A happy disposition fermented in sorrow describes the Brazilian spirit. I am the result of this. A couple of days after putting my Kiwano seats to rest in their palatial cribs, I went to check their progress. With constant balmy temperatures inside the china cabinet, they were sure to grow. This was the last week of May after all, in a house without central air conditioning. Sure enough, a few seeds had broken their shells, and white roots were emerging seeking soil. It's always exciting to test out new species. I have no clue what this is going to actually taste like, and I can only hope that it's going to grow well, knowing that it's from a completely different place in the world. Who knows how it's going to fare here in the fair weather of Maryland. If you are pre-sprouting seeds, never allow the root to grow spindly. It will decrease the quality of your plants. This method of pre-sprouting is especially handy for expensive or rare seeds. And that is the thing about exotic species. They are accustomed to a different environment. They can either flourish or flounder, and it all depends on the conditions you give them to grow in. Growing all these different plants from all over the world made me think of my own family tree. I was always curious to know my genetic heritage, to find my proverbial roots. While I am light-skinned, white as I would be classed in Brazil, I knew that my Portuguese ancestry was not the full story. So I decided to take a DNA test to find out. After spitting in a vial and sending it by mail, I had to wait for the results while a technician in some remote office park processed the spit of thousands of people as a way to make a living. While I waited, the African melon seedlings were busy pumping out one leaf after the other. The weather had been unusually rainy, even for June, so I was beginning to worry if these melons would succumb to some rude fungal disease or wilt, as is common in rainy weather. The extra rain had peppered the soil with volunteer plants, so I had to find the right niche for them. I plan to grow these wild or exotic African fruit right over here close to this trellis. There are some volunteer beans that have sprouted, the yard-long beans, and I actually don't plan on taking them out, because if these don't work, at least I'll have yard-long beans, because I know they do grow well. So I do have to clear the area from a lot of the morning glory that has sprouted, but that should be easy enough. This corner is the sunniest corner in my house. It gets both morning and afternoon sunlight. This is the greatest issue I have to contend with in my yard. Well, besides contending with the voracious groundhog you are probably tired of hearing about. Since I am in the north-facing side of a river valley, that fact alone puts me at a disadvantage, so I have to prop up sun-loving plants and save the sunniest spots for them. This is always a struggle because naturally I want to put my best well-known producers at center stage, but my love for trying new plants always makes me reserve a prime spot for the newcomers. With the seedlings planted at the best spot I could find, they just had to grow, flower, and fruit. Then I could find out what the cucumber, banana, lemon, pineapple, whatever taste was all about. Meanwhile, I checked to see the results from my DNA test. I would scientifically find out what sort of human flavor I was. Sure enough, much like this alluring African melon, I'm a flavor composite. The map lit up with candy-colored representation from mostly all over. Turns out, I'm 85% European, specifically 50% Portuguese, the rest being Italian, British, and some others. But I am also close to 10% Sub-Saharan African, mostly from Western and Central Africa, where most slaves came from. I had a clear connection with Africa. Perhaps part of my ancestors knew exactly what this strange fruit was. A few weeks later, the African melon seedlings were struggling to grow. The yard-long volunteer beans were starting to take over, and a volunteer Holland cucumber that I had previously mistaken for the African melon was growing so well that it had been nibbled by the groundhog, prompting me to put some protective wire cages around it. A couple weeks later, the volunteer cucumber was looking spectacular and was already starting to flower. We were well past the summer solstice, and the days were starting to get shorter. I was worrying if the African melon vines would have enough solar energy to spring up and fruit. Fortunately, they were starting to show vigorous growth. I could clearly distinguish them from the cucumbers by their thinner stems and smaller leaves. Once they got going, they grew at full steam. They reached upwards towards the sky, seeking the sun. I also had cucumella growing beside it, and the volunteer cucumber was starting to set fruit. This cucumber had most likely grown from last year's bumper crop of cucumbers. A forgotten fruit had probably fallen to the ground and survived winter, waiting for the right spring conditions to sprout. It's astonishing to think that it knows when to sprout. That's the mystery of birth. While I waited for my melon vine to grow and flower, I decided to research more about my origins. Having African ancestry in Brazil would class me as Panasenzala, an off-color remark that roughly translates to having a foot in the slave quarters. This racist notion links African ancestry as a negative trait. There is a tendency in Brazil to highlight your European ancestry with pride while hiding any connection to African peoples. I may have African blood in me, but because of my lighter skin, I will never know what it means to go through life in a darker body that reads more clearly as African. As a child moving from São Paulo with a more European population to Salvador with a more African one, I quickly became aware how society valued lighter bodies more. At times, racism against others was explicit, but most times implicit in daily living. Brazil may not have had formal legal segregation after emancipation in 1888, but it excels at being informal, as claiming to have forgotten race. Brazil likes to forget things. Up until 1888, Brazil had a proportionally darker population, but for some reason, my genetic background skewed toward European. I wanted to look further into this, to see if this was a trend. I was troubled by what I found. After slavery was legally abolished in Brazil, the ideology of embranquecimento, or whitening, was promoted by the lighter Brazilian elite. Different from legal racial segregation, as seen in the United States and South Africa, racial whitening sought to control the dark population by lightening it through miscegenation. Rooted in the time's social Darwinism, through scientific racialism, whitening was seen as a way of redeeming the Brazilian population. João Batista Lacerda, a director of the Brazilian National Museum, made these racist views explicit in an article published during the first Universal Racist Congress held in London in 1911. Titled About the Mixed People of Brazil and originally published in French, Lacerda's paper concludes that the importation for a long time of the black race to Brazil had a nefarious influence in the country's progress, that the character of the population suffered the defects and vices of the inferior imported race. He goes to propose that in 1 century, probably the population of Brazil will be formed in most part by individuals of the white Latin race, and at the same time the black and Indian will without a doubt disappear from this part of America. This ideology is depicted in the painting The Redemption of Ham by Spanish artist Brocos, which was exhibited in that same Congress as a poster child of whitening. In it we see a darker African grandmother praising God for a lighter daughter and an even lighter grandchild. It references the biblical story of Ham, who is cursed by God, and infers that African peoples were the cursed descendants of Ham, who through whitening could find redemption. It is harrowing to think this nefarious ideology was the dominant force in Brazilian government, as European immigration was subsequently encouraged, while African and some Asian immigration was discouraged and even prohibited by law. These ideas sought to make the darker ethnicities disappear. The Brazilian elite wanted the world to forget them, wanted us to forget the past. I cannot help but think of the somber symbol of the Brazilian National Museum, recently up in flames. Looking at my own more recent ancestry through family photographs, I see the echoes of this concept in action. I can see that my mother was lighter than my grandmother, who was lighter than her mother. Thankfully, Lacerda was deeply wrong and didn't quite understand genetics. While the more recent government-sponsored influx of Europeans did result in a proportionally lighter population than before, darker people did not disappear, thank God. We became more diverse, and a genetically diverse population has many actual advantages. Why am I saying all of this? And what does this have to do with the African melon I planted in my porch? Well, genetic diversity is key to overcoming hardship in all living things. There is something called hybrid vigor, or heterosis, that is clearly seen in the plant world and also in animal husbandry. It refers to an offspring of two different varieties or species having less recessive traits that could have an undesirable effect. That is why a large portion of commercial seeds are hybrid. They may show traits of disease resistance or larger yield as hybrid corn has commercially. The process of inbreeding in artificial selection has the effect of selecting for specific traits while having the unintended consequence of increasing some undesirable traits by decreasing genetic material. This is more clearly seen in some highly inbred plants such as heirloom tomatoes that while they show exquisite flavor, what they were actually selected for, they are generally much less disease resistant than their wild counterparts, because in a domesticated setting where humans coax the plants to production and intervene to prevent and suppress disease pressures, disease resistance is generally not selected for concurrently with flavor. In a couple of weeks, the script had flipped and my African melon vine had grown over the trellis, creating a beautiful mat of green. The African melon has taken over and created this wall of green. In fact, they're actually growing onto the gutters and over the roof of the porch, which never happened. So it really wants to grow, which is really nice. However, I haven't seen one flower from it, so I'm getting concerned. And it's not just the African melon, but also the cucamelons. They have grown and they're starting to produce food, but absolutely no flowers from the African melon. I don't know if it takes too long for it to start to flower. I don't know if I'm going to have a long enough season. It looks beautiful, but I'd really love to know how it tastes. We'll see if we can get lucky. I could see the vigor of my African melon in action. The plant grew stronger than any other cucurbitain vine I had ever planted. It showed no signs of decline, while other, more domesticated plants around it from the same family were succumbing to disease. I knew there had to be clear survival advantages in this wilder variety, so I went looking in the scientific literature to find out. African melon, or Cucumis metuliferus, as it is scientifically known, has indeed been in the radar of plant breeders as a crop with potential disease resistance that would be valuable. African melon is resistant to a root nematode that affects other domesticated cucurbits, as well as to the fungal melon vine decline and fusarian wilt. African melon is a more distinct species from the domesticated cucumber or melon, so breeding experiments have not produced a commercially viable hybrid yet. Towards the end of summer, beginning of autumn, the vines had weaved themselves into a luxurious wallpaper of green, unlike anything I had ever experienced in my yard. As summer ended, my hopes of getting to taste African melon got slimmer and slimmer. I went in search of a scientific answer online as to why my exuberant vine refused to flower. I found a paper on an experiment linking temperature and season to fruit production in kiwano. In it, I learned that kiwano does produce male and female flowers, and it is self-fertile, so it wasn't the case that I had a male vine or something like that. In the experiment, they sowed seeds in the 15th of March, 15th of April, and 3rd of June. The best group to flower and set fruit was the 15th of March one, with the 15th of April struggling a bit, and the early June not flowering at all until October. So there was my answer. I had waited too long to plant them. Kiwano appears to thrive in drier, sunnier climates. Trying to grow it in cooler and wetter Maryland would require adjustments, maybe even a greenhouse or cold frame. But even though I did not have the pleasure to find out what the alluring African melon really tastes like, I did learn new things, and this plant's vigor and disease resistance got me thinking. There had to be a way of using that to our advantage. So I kept researching, and I found a paper that shows signs that grafting domesticated melons onto the roots of African melons showed disease resistance, while maintaining fruit quality and taste. That is why we need genetic diversity. It increases our library of traits to work with. That is why we need to preserve native ecosystems like the Amazon rainforest that is a treasure trove of genetic diversity we still know very little of. As for human diversity, there is more to the story, and comparing human diversity directly to biological diversity in plants or other animal species is not always productive and can lead to wrong conclusions. Modern genetics informs us that humans are more similar and diverse in different ways than we have thought of in the past. The old concept of human races with different characteristics is misguided because much research shows that humans are really not that different. So race, as classically defined, is not recognized in modern biology. Race, white, black, Asian, are more sociological phenomena than genetic. There is really only one human race. There are what are called different human populations that share some common phenotypes because of past geographical isolation, but human diversity within those groups rival differences amongst groups. That means that two random people within a race can have even more genetic differences than two random people from different population groups, because the vast majority of our genetic diversity is deep inside and visible to the eyes. While you could separate humans in different genetic groups, they do not fall neatly on the classic race lines. So the way we treat race socially impacts behavior way more than any supposed biological determinism that is just not there. As the Little Prince says, the essential is invisible to the eyes. If you enjoyed this video and would like to support the channel by purchasing a painting from my garden, please visit my Etsy shop. These are one-of-a-kind pieces, so hurry! I'd like to personally thank everyone who has supported the channel by purchasing art through my Etsy store or by supporting me through Patreon, as well as by watching the ads in the videos. Your support is the reason why new videos are being made.